Hi everybody, I'm Yair from Rain the Dog. You are now watching the third lecture in our series of Selenium for Beginners. Let's start with the agenda for today. In the previous meetings, we talked about requirements and dependencies and how to install. We talked about the Selenium Webdriver, and we also presented the final project demo. Also, we talked about what is a web element, how to interact with it, and how to locate it. If you haven't watched the videos, please click on the link down below. The agenda for today would be to introduce TestNG and test annotation, and also how to make your code more reusable, and we'll also study about the project architecture design. TestNG. TestNG is a testing framework inspired by JUnit and NUnit. TestNG is introducing some new functionalities that make it more powerful and easier to use. TestNG, as the others, lets you use test annotations. It also can enable you to run tests in parallel mode. It has test listeners, data providers, parameters, and more. In this meeting, we will overview TestNG and its basics. Why do we need TestNG? You need to remember that Selenium is only the WebDriver. It's only interacting with our web browser and nothing more. TestNG is a testing framework. It can enable us to run tests, to manage them, to have preconditions and post-conditions, to generate reports and logger, and much more. Using a testing framework should be part of any automation project that you are developing. As was mentioned before, TestNG has test annotations. Those test annotations are indicators for the program to read some components of our test. The most basic annotation is the test annotation. That's the basic one. It marks a method as a test. We can have multiple test annotation in one class. Each of them will be serving as a single test. Think about one class with different mains that you can run the program several times, or run only one of them, or multiple of them. A test method can receive parameters and test data, and the test method should always be void. There are some rare cases that the test method is not void, but for our purposes, it will be always void. Let's create a new file. We'll call it example3. Now we won't use main. Let's say we'll call it public void Gmail navigation. This one is related to our final project. Now we need to mark this method as a test. Above it, we'll use the annotation mark, the @ and then we'll add test with capital T. So here you can see that in my POM.xml there is the TestNG already, but probably I didn't import it. So there is another way of importing the TestNG beside the one that we saw in the previous meetings. We can use this bulb, we can add Maven dependency, and then we can search for an artifact. Here we can type TestNG, and the first result is all of the versions of TestNG. We'll take the latest one, the 7.3.0, which is not beta, but it's a good version. Now it's being added. Now we can import the changes. And as you can see now, I can import the annotation. Now I can choose between the two. Of course, we are using TestNG, so we won't import it from JUnit. Now it's been imported from TestNG annotation.test. If you bump in an error message of the default loading of DTD, just copy from the error the flag, the -d testng.dtd http equals true, and then you need to go to Run Configurations, to the Edit Configurations, and here just delete the current VM options and paste this one. That's it. Now you need to run it not by right clicking on the file, you need to run it from the Run Configurations. The error that you see now is because I've included the system set property from the previous meeting and I'm using Mac. So I can comment it out because I don't need it, and then we can run our test. Now you can see that we have navigated to Gmail welcome page. Here we have a past test. Of course it's passed because we haven't tried to fail it for anything. It just navigated to gmail.com. Just for the example, you can see that I can add another test annotation. I can create a second test method. We can call it my test2. This test would only print I'm test number 2. Okay, so now we can run it. Now you can see the execution summary. The first test took 3 seconds and 660 milliseconds. The second test took only 1 millisecond because it only printed I am test 2. But now we have the summary. We have 2 tests under example number 3. So that way, by using the test annotation, you can run multiple tests under the same class. By the way, we can add extra parameters to the test annotation. In this instance, you can see that I can add group such as sanity and login tests to my test. Let's say one test can be in several groups, and we can only, when we execute the test, we can only run this group. Let's say that my boss is telling me, run all the sanity tests that you have. I can just mark the sanities and all of them will run. Any subset can be executed by using this one. Also, some reports such as Allure would mark the test by its groups. Some other useful annotations such as the before and after. So we have several ones. The before suite is something that would happen once when all of our test suite will be executed. The before class would happen before our class. In the previous example, you saw that we had 1 class and 2 tests. So it would happen before the class would load. The before method, it's before each of the test method. This is the most useful one, by the way. Don't be mistaken by the before test, because the before test only happens once before one test method. Only once. So usually we're using the before method if we want to have a precondition to each of the tests. A nice precondition could be to initiate the Webdriver. We also have the after annotations. After suite, just the same as before, it would happen when all of the tests are completing their execution. The after class would happen after the class would be executed. The after method after each of the test method. Let's go back to our code and we will add those annotations. Let's declare an annotation. We'll call it before class. Let's say it's our environment setup. So if you want to have this system set property, that's probably the best place to locate it, to relocate it. Let's add the annotation before method. We can call it test setup. This one will run before each of the tests. In my opinion, the best practice is to initialize the Webdriver before each of the test methods. Also to quit it after each of the test methods. Many people would disagree, but I do believe that this is the best way to make sure that none of your tests are failing due to wrong configuration. We'll add the Webdriver to be a member of this class, and just like in a constructor, we will initialize it before each of the tests. Also, we will add the etiquette after method. We can call it teardown, and here we can quit our Webdriver. So each test will start a Webdriver, will do whatever the test is doing, and after it will quit the Webdriver so it won't stay open in our computer. I will comment out the system set property, I don't really need it now. We can just print I'm in environment setup, so you would see that it only happened once. So what happened? One test opened the first browser, the second test opened the second browser, and both of them were closed. Also, we can see our message, I'm in environment setup. Assertions. They allow us to test the results of our test in various stages. Without assertion, our test might be marked as passed even though something has failed along the way. We can assert many types of the result, such as Boolean assertions, strings, integers, null values, and more. You should always include assertions in your tests. Think about a manual testing. Whenever you're performing a manual test, you have the expected result and the actual result. The same one can be measured with the assertion. Let's go back to our code. In our first example, let's get the current URL of the website that we are now in. It should be Gmail. And here we would make sure that the URL contains the word Gmail. So in this test, we are trying to navigate to gmail.com. If from some reason we are currently not in Gmail, so our test would fail. Let's run it. Okay, we have an assertion error. From some reason, we didn't find Gmail in the URL. So now we need to check out what is going on, because the test looks valid. One of the advantages of using assertion of TestNG is that we can also print a message. This message will only be printed if we have a fail, such as the failure that we've seen here. Now we'll print the current URL. Okay, we expected the Gmail, and now we have found accounts google.com. So in this whole string, we can find the word Gmail even once. So probably whenever we navigate to gmail.com, we've been redirected to account.gmail.com. So let's say for our purposes, it's sufficient for us to say that the URL contained the word Google. Now we expect that this test would pass. And as expected, the test now has passed because Google appears in this URL. By the way, this is not a very useful assertion, because sometimes you can navigate to a web page and this web page won't be even loaded. Even though it's not loaded, we might get a correct answer for that. So we just tested the URL. A better practice is to see if one of the elements that we expect to see in this page is already appearing there, and then we can be more certain that we arrive to our destination. So now let's debug it. Now, when we arrive Gmail, by the way, you see Gmail in Hebrew because Google is redirecting us to the Hebrew web page. So since we know that Google is using geolocation targeting, trying to assert the text of this page is not a good practice, because this test would have different results from any country that I will run it on. So let's try to identify one of the elements. If we right click on it, we have the identifier ID. This is an ID. It's very good for us to check it out. So let's find this element. Let's call it web element user text box equals driver find element by ID. We need to import by. Here we can paste the identifier ID that we copied from the browser. Let's say that we expected that this element won't be null, so we can assert not null, user text box, and we can add the etiquette message in case that this test will fail. We'll say user text box has not found. Maybe has not been found. It's better English, but we'll go with this one. Let's run it. Okay. Both browsers were closed. This test has two expected results. The first assertion is the URL, and we expect that the URL would contain Google. And the second one, we expect that the user text box would appear and not be null. So I think we got a pretty good idea that we navigated to Gmail, and this Gmail login page was loaded because also the URL contained Google and we had the text box and it wasn't null. Let's try and locate a different ID just to demonstrate and run it. Here. Now we got no such element exception. So line number 39 wasn't even executed because we got an exception. In my opinion, this is not also a good practice. I encourage you to watch our series of lectures beyond Selenium, especially the first one, which is called Get Element. We can wrap the Selenium find element by and catch the exception. Then we can return a value. We can return a null or the web element itself. Then we can assert it. In my opinion, the best practice always, if your test is failing, it should fail on assertion and not on exception, because exception can be unexpected. So you should always handle it in your test. Data providers are also useful tools. Let's say that you have many users that you want to make sure that all of those users can log in to a certain application. Instead of just copying and pasting your test many times, you can have an external file, let's say a CSV file, that can contain all the users and the password of those users. And you can provide it to your test as a data provider, and all of them would run on the same test. This is something that is built in TestNG, and it's very useful. We won't go over data providers here because this is just the basics, but if you want to see a video about it, please comment in the comment section down below, and if this comment would get at least 100 thumbs up, I promise you that we will make a video about it. TestNG XML. TestNG XML is a very useful tool to manage your tests. You can create different XMLs for all of your tests. You can create one XML and manage all of your tests from this one. I like to call it my test manager. How do we create this XML? Let's go back to our project. By the way, in this slide I copied all of this from the TestNG website. So we can go to Google, we can just write down testng.xml, and here we can copy the basic structure of it. Now we will create a new file in the root of our project. We can call it testng.xml. By the way, you can call the testng.xml in any name that you want, but if you want to use a name which is not the default name, you need to provide a flag whenever you try to run your suite, because TestNG will look for testng.xml as a default. I probably copied the wrong example. Let's copy the second one. By the way, you can see that we have the include and exclude in the TestNG examples from the TestNG website. So it's very useful. If you want to exclude a certain test because you know it's failing all the time due to a bug, you can just exclude it by using the XML tag. So the only thing that we need now is to copy this one. By the way, you can see that we have the groups here, as we saw in one of the previous slides. I'll delete it for now because we don't really need it. Let's specify the class name. It's example number 3. And let's say that I want to run only the Gmail navigation. That's the only test that I want to run now. So under methods tag, I will say I'm including the Gmail navigation. Yeah, let's just add the suite tag. Yeah, and now when we right click on it, you can see that it can be executable. Now we ran our test, and the only test that we ran is the Gmail navigation because we specified that this is the only test that should be included in our testng XML. Let's say I have another class, so under the classes tag I can add class number 2, which is called example2, and here we can include other tests. And if we won't specify, we expect that it will run all of the tests that we have in example 2. So here you can see that you can have multiple XMLs. If you have a CI/CD system such as Jenkins, it's very easy to run all of those tests. TestNG also has a built-in reporting system. Those reports will be auto-generated automatically to the test output folder. Those are very basic reports. I do recommend that if you're developing a large-scale project, you should integrate an external reporting such as Allure or Extent Report. In the next meeting, which is part of this workshop, we would go over an external reporting provider. If you don't see the test output report, you should go to the edit configurations, you should look for listeners, and under listeners, you should check include default reports. Let's add another assertion to our test. We'll say assert true and we'll give it the parameter false, so this test would fail. Because we want to see it in our report, we'll also provide a fail message, I failed. Let's run it. Now both tests have been executed. The second one has failed. And you can see we have the test output folder. And here we have several files. We can use the index or the emailable report. We'll open the emailable report. Let's open it in Finder, so we would be able to open it with a browser and not the editor. Here you can see the test. It's the name of the project from 0 to Selenium. We have one passed, one failed. We have the time that it took, what was the duration of the test, and also we have the exception and the error message. Of course, we can include a screenshot and a lot of other stuff that automation developers like to include in their report. In the next meeting, by the way, we'll see a much more refined and better looking report. In the next meetup, we will include the project architecture, and I've also added how to use weights. And we also make the code more reusable. It was planned for this lecture, but we'll continue with that in the next meeting. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do it now. If you like this video and you want us to make more content like this, please give us the thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comment section down below, and until next time, have a good one.